Hi everybody, and welcome to episode 45 of Now and Men, the podcast on men, masculinities, and gender equality. It's Stephen Burrell here, and I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Boomerang people in Naarm, here in Australia. And I'm here with my co-host Sandy, as always. How are you, Sandy?
I'm fine, thanks, but it's been rather a strange time here in the UK recently. We've got a new government, which has kind of hit the ground running, but it's also faced significant challenges, and we're going to talk about that today. Meanwhile, personally, I've spent 2 weeks on the sofa watching the Olympics, followed by some time on holiday on the beautiful Gower Peninsula in South Wales, and I suspect I'm going to be returning to the sofa now for the Paralympics, because when you've said A, you kind of have to say B, really. So that's me. How about you, Stephen?
Yes, I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I must confess I haven't been watching the Olympics, although, of course, I couldn't avoid all of the storm that was happening around Reagan here in Australia, which is very interesting. And also, just as a side note, recently, if we're talking about Australian-themed things, I did have a rather large spider on the window in this room where we record the podcast, called a Victorian huntsman spider, bigger than anything I've ever seen before. So if you see me just looking nervously to the side at any point, you know why.
Right.
But yes, no doubt listeners will have seen that for a week between the end of July and the beginning of August this year, the UK was shaken by far-right xenophobic riots in around 20 towns and cities across England and Northern Ireland, which included racist violence, arson, looting, and in the most severe cases, rioters attacked homes and businesses owned by immigrants and attacked hotels housing asylum-seekers as well. And the riots began in Southport, which is a town near Liverpool, after the horrific murder of 3 young girls there and the injuring of 8 other children, as well as 2 adults, about which the far-right spread claims that the perpetrator was a Muslim migrant or asylum-seeker, and that turned out to be wholly false.
So we therefore wanted to understand the role that masculinity might be playing in these riots, and to do so, we're speaking today to an expert in gender extremism and the far right, Dr. Elizabeth Pearson. Elizabeth is a senior lecturer in criminology at Royal Holloway, University of London, and she's recently published a book called Extreme Britain, Gender, Masculinity and Radicalisation. She's also previously worked as a radio journalist for the BBC. So hi, Elizabeth, and thanks very much for joining us today.
Hi, and thanks very much for inviting me to be on.
So to begin with, Elizabeth, I wonder what was going through your mind when you saw the riots unfolding in the UK as somebody who's been working in this field for a long time. Like, how did you feel when you saw what was going on?
Yeah, I felt a lot of different things. I felt, I guess, anger, frustration. I felt, a degree of understanding. Obviously, as you say, the book Extreme Britain looks at anti-Islam far-right movements, and some of the key figures in the far-right were involved in inciting more violence, inciting protest, sharing disinformation in the wake of those awful murders of the 3 young girls. I felt paralysis in a sense, because you are watching this unfold and you don't have enough answers to stop this actually happening. I felt shame, because this is, my country, and this is not the kind of country that I want to live in. So I felt a whole range of different things, onto which I, obviously then try to put this kind of more analytic framework that we try and use to understand the more awful things. And, most of my research does involve looking at the darker side of society. I work in a criminology department. I study extremism and I study terrorism, and I use gender to try and get a bit more insight into how things like the riots, although, the riots were not actually, I wasn't out there going to those protests or, watching that violence unfold. So, yeah, it was quite, it was a terrible week, I think, for this country. And there's going to have to be a lot of long-term work done in building resilience in communities, because there are so many flashpoints. There's so much in the news that can trigger the sort of emotions that lead to this kind of event. And people at the moment are bombarded with information which, is really emotionally provocative. And it is that kind of emotion which is so easily manipulated, stoked, directed, channeled by people who have got particular aims, including, Tommy Robinson, who we saw very active on social media, Andrew Tate, who is not necessarily, it's debate, is he a far-right activist? But he's not sort of typical. He's mixed race, he's Muslim. And, then we have actual, politicians, including Nigel Farage, and amongst other actors internationally who are involved in, increasing the divisiveness around those events, I think.
Yeah, and how did you feel about the response of the authorities, which I guess was focused largely on criminality, arrests, imprisonment, and presumably you were also perhaps heartened by the upsurge in counter-protesters and kind of anti-racism rallies that we saw as well, which of course did heavily outnumber the kind of the far-right riots that happened?
Sure, I think that was one positive. Not that I think that that the lasting impacts on people of colour, on immigrant populations, on Muslims, those, something like this happens. The lasting impact is really difficult to it's hard to make that go away, I think, from what I've seen and read of people of colour and immigrant heritage population kind of talking about the impacts on them. But yeah, it's important that communities are out there showing that this is not, people from the same communities are out there showing this is not what they are about. There's positive messages there. The government, I don't think, had a great deal of choice in terms of, quickly putting these people through the courts with these quite, harsh deterrent sentences. I honestly don't think that there was much of a choice around that. It's that short term, it's a necessary step to take. But long term, there can't be any sort of shying away from the work within communities, particularly where communities, I guess at the coalface of multiculturalism, where those tensions are the most easily exploited and where people, I think, have, concerns, issues which are not being resolved and which they're left to kind of struggle and deal with, which is also something I should say that I saw in the research that I was doing with the anti-Islam movements. And this was, this was before COVID. The research was taking place from 2015 to 2018. So it was a different landscape because we hadn't had the pandemic. We hadn't had, I think, the prevalence of conspiracy theories. Twitter wasn't quite the environment which it now is. And I have to say also, when I was watching what was happening, I wasn't necessarily particularly surprised. Not that I think that, England, and it really was mainly just England, is a far-right hotbed or is like, a particularly racist place. But, we've seen, Tommy Robinson has gained in popularity in recent months since he was returned to what was Twitter X by Elon Musk in November, and his return to Twitter with other people who'd been removed because of hate speech and far-right activism. That was just before Armistice Day and that protest. And there had been, he's gained in followers and his narrative is clearly gaining him, it resonates with many people. So in a sense, although this is obviously the worst type of behaviour that we've seen for some time, it doesn't surprise me. And I say that also from looking at other contexts, that have had similar kinds of spates of racist events that have involved the targeting of minority groups. I'm thinking of, this probably doesn't seem like a very straightforward comparison, but, you think of, pogroms against Tamils in Sri Lanka, for instance, going back in history. So, and I don't think any community or population is immune from these kinds of strains and that kind of violence.
I guess it's important to note as well, isn't it, that, what had actually happened before the riots began was this horrific killing of 3 very young girls. And, one can only imagine the impact on their families, on the other children that were attacked that day in Southport, everyone that was there that was witnesses to that, the traumatic impacts that would have had. Yeah, and I guess the riots really took their focus away from that, didn't they? They moved the discussion once again away from men's violence against women and girls, which is obviously something which we have so much more to do to address in the UK. I mean, yeah, did you have any thoughts about that as well, about how it actually it took the attention away from that, I guess?
Sure. I mean, I wrote about this afterwards, and I think that you have a grief reaction, and the murders of these girls are not. That grief is owned by people locally, but it is about, essentially it's about, we don't know what motivated the attacker in this case, a young person, a 17-year-old, and obviously that will go to trial. We'll find out more about that. But so I wrote about gender in the aftermath of the riots and the way in which one form of men's violence against these children at this sort of summer holiday dance class, very small children. And it is very difficult to understand that kind of attack and why anyone would do that. And how that trauma, that emotional reaction, which is completely understandable across the whole country, I think there was a sort of sense of collective incomprehension and trauma at this event, and how quickly that becomes funneled into this other form of collective male violence, which was expressed in these, originally the press called them protests, but they very quickly became, riots, looting. That was absolutely nothing to do with these girls, images of people emerging with, handfuls of fake Crocs from Shoe Zone, or people coming out of Greggs. Why, the unfathomable, why loot these, why loot anywhere? This is not an appropriate response to what is essentially an awful tragedy. And I wrote around, gender and the far right, and this, the importance of these gendered narratives to what the far right does. And I include the anti-Islam movement, which Tommy Robinson has repeatedly kind of tried to push back on this designation of far right, but the kind of overlaps, the continuities between, the more traditional, in inverted commas, forms of the far right, the neo-Nazi, and the new, in inverted commas, street movement that grew up in response to people like Anjem Choudhury in the late 2000s and early 2010s. So this is really kind of predicated on what has always been this sort of nationalist, owned by states as well as by far-right groups, obviously, this idea that the men of the nation have a duty, responsibility to protect the women and children of the nation. And, in the far right, this is pushed away from the idea of the state onto the nation, separate from the state. And a really sort of clear narrative is that the state has not protected the women of the nation, the women and children of that nation, and that it's up to white, non-Muslim men and women in this case to do that protection themselves. And when you get an incident where, highly traumatic incident where children are targeted, and we've seen the far right, mobilise around these incidents, whether that's child sexual exploitation, so-called grooming gangs, rape cases, generally cases where, justice has not yet been meted out by the state, or there's no sense that justice is likely to be meted out by the state, then you get those events kind of subsumed in this far-right narrative and this mobilisation towards either protest, which is really what I was looking at when I was doing my research, or violence, and sometimes protest becomes violence. So that gendered narrative is integral to those forms of activism, essentially. And this is, again, what we saw here. And it hasn't made the situation any better for anyone, and has clearly made the situation a lot worse in a lot of different ways, locally, individually, personally, nationally, transnationally. And we've seen how a variety of different actors with different motivations have become have latched onto this incident in order to manipulate it, to make it something that they want it to be.
Yeah, you've also talked about the link between domestic violence and terrorism, I think, and feminists have been highlighting that issue repeatedly for some time, but it's only recently been recognised a bit more widely, hasn't it, that, incels are gaining attention in the media, amongst policymakers and security services and so on. And I wondered if you want to say a little bit more about the connection between domestic violence and terrorism.
I think it's something that we don't know exactly what that connection looks like. I think that it's really important to investigate that connection. But personally, I'm interested in the connections between public and private manifestations of men's violence, public manifestations, collective manifestations of that violence, and I'm interested in the connections between that and extremism and terrorism. But I wouldn't want to draw too strong a line partly because we don't know exactly what those lines are to be drawn, and also because of state responses, because I don't have a great deal of trust in state responses to these events, either in policing or in counter-terrorism or countering violent extremism policing. So, misogyny, as we know, is everywhere. It's in our state institutions. It's across police. It is everywhere, online and off. Domestic violence is extremely prevalent in terms of the numbers. Terrorism offences are much less prevalent in terms of the numbers. So I wouldn't want to draw this kind of link between something which is everywhere and something which is much, much less prevalent in terms of, now I'm thinking of terrorist offences. And particularly, I've seen people say, Joan Smith, for instance, has written about, the links, the histories of domestic violence in the backgrounds of terrorist offenders. But we can't make the same argument the other way around. We can't say, look, every domestic violence offender is going to be a terrorist because, and some people have called for domestic violence to be seen as a red flag, as a kind of indicator of potential terrorist offences. I'd be extremely wary of doing it that way round, because the people who are most likely to suffer in this case are the women who are, trying to report these things. And it's, and particularly because counter-terrorism practices are not just gendered, they are racialised. So we've seen in past years it's tended to be, counter-terrorism has focused on, not on the far right, but on Muslim men actually. And, they have tended to be broadly stigmatised as suspect communities. And we know that the PREVENT strategy, which is the counter-radicalisation strategy in England and Wales specifically, has been, when it was first rolled out, it was rolled out in direct proportion to Muslim demography. So it was, where do we need to put this? Well, we need to put this where there are, large Muslim communities, which is an extremely troubling kind of correlation. And that caused a huge amount of resentment because of the unfairness of it, of this assumption that, terrorism was directly a product of intense populations of Muslim people. Which is not something that you can strictly say. So I have, some nervousness around the lack of nuance in the way that gender has been integrated into counter-terrorism policy and the practicalities of that policing. Now, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be investigation of those relationships, those links between that form of private violence. And, we do know that it is there in a lot of the backstories of people who are involved in public and collective violence. But I would support, the team at UCL, for instance, Caitlin Clemmo, Bettina Rottweiler, under Paul Gill, they are doing some really good work in trying to disaggregate what are those linkages, how does this work, and being really careful and nuanced about looking at the complexities in those relationships. But there's a lot to unpick there. I think the work of unpicking those relationships is just beginning.
Right.
It's not at its end point.
Yeah. It's important too, I think, to respond, to think about how men in general respond to the challenges that are presented, the hyper-masculine, if you like, far right. And, you've written, I think, that we need a community of men to help build a counter-narrative. It occurred to me, and I was thinking about that question, well, maybe shows like this are kind of important, that we do connect with a whole group of men out there and women. And, it's important that they should inform themselves and be part of this conversation as well. So I wondered if you wanted to explain what you said there about community of men helping to build a counter-narrative.
I sort of feel when I reread that, I was a bit like, oh, it sounds quite sort of, it's a little bit, it's like, well, wait, what do you mean? It's like, it's a bit glib. It's a bit like, oh yeah, if only we had, men who cared about this. I think, I suppose I was thinking, partly I was thinking women who are doing this work, and it is a lot, it's a lot about women, because obviously we have been the ones who are impacted by, misogynist abuse, by police not investigating rape properly, by appalling, 1% of, conviction rate or whatever it is for of course it's women that sort of bang on about these things because it's us that are at the sharp end of it. But men are also, I do not think that feminism or gender equality is about just improving women's lot. I like to think, and perhaps I am naive about this, that, these things are about improving. Men and women don't live distinctly from one another. They live together. We share everything together, work environments, social environments. This isn't a job for either men or women alone. They have to do it hand in hand. Otherwise it can never work. And I guess, I firstly would want, in my immediate sphere of male academics working on extremism, for them to take misogyny seriously, and also for men to feel like that this is something that they can be proactive about. When you talk to people who are engaged in thinking of extremism specifically, when I've talked to people involved in delivering those counter-extremism interventions, so how do they get men on board, sort of talking and challenging and discussing and being open to listening to the problems that young men, or that anti-Islam members of groups that support Tommy Robinson or who retweet him on X or wherever, really kind of, and this is becoming so much more difficult in the current kind of polarized context, but sort of really working to produce something, a vision of something that isn't, an Elon Musk, that these role models aren't people who are divisive and entrenched in these extraordinarily binary positions of what men and women should be, that they don't see feminism as something which is, an enemy, a problem. The difficulty is that the kind of masculinities that I am talking about are often seen as weakness. And, liberal, effeminate, cooked, emasculated. This is the kind of man that Andrew Tate is kind of, basically saying, these are the kind of men that these women want, they're trying to raise me, and they're trying to replace me with these kind of cooked guys who won't stand up for themselves. They've kind of capitulated to these, to these women. And, this makes the conversation really, really difficult, I think. But, I think men have these role models in their thousands, on social media. And unfortunately, a lot of social media is a lot of where this conversation happens. You've got your Musks, your Tates, your Robinsons, your Petersons. And I'm wondering where the alternatives are for men to kind of rally around. And I guess I am looking to men to produce those alternatives, because, I can't do that. I don't think it's up to women to solve. I don't even think there's a problem, that there's a gender problem, there's a gender relationship problem. There's not a masculinity problem. I don't think there's masculinity in crisis, but I think gender relations might be in a sort of crisis at the moment. And, that's not a problem just for men to solve on their own.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We've just been joined by Liz's very beautiful dog, so hopefully we won't get too distracted. So Liz, as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, you've just had a book come out recently, which is based on your PhD research, and that looks at the role of gender both in kind of far-right politics, but also in kind of Islamist extremist groups in the UK. And in the book, one of the key arguments you make is that radicalisation, extremist radicalisation, can be seen as a kind of masculinity project for men who get involved. And of course, it is predominantly men, as we saw on the riots, although, as you point out, not exclusively men, of course. And was the case both for men on the far right, but also for those involved in Islamist extremist groups as well. So yeah, could you perhaps just explain a bit more about what you mean by that? What is this kind of masculinity project which you found these men to be kind of undertaking?
Yeah, so the whole book is really about kind of looking at that story of how people got into these groups. So I was talking to people and letting them tell their own stories, really. And sort of at the end of looking through all the interviews, I was obviously looking at how gender was important. I came to the conclusion that there wasn't a stage of the journey towards these groups in which masculinities were not important, in which the fulfillment of being a particular kind of man, or for women, because they are also doing masculinities, this wasn't important. And of course, ideologically, as we sort of mentioned, the idea of what kind of masculinity you need to embody, is your duty to embody, is kind of fundamental to thinking about how both the far right and Islamist groups, in this case I was just looking at the one group, al-Muhajirun, how they position themselves and what kind of aspirations and objectives that people have when they're becoming part of these groups. So, and I wanted that really to sort of, that idea of radicalisation as a masculinity project really to kind of just make central the fact that masculinities really matter, that gender really matters in thinking about why people are part of these groups. And that it doesn't also matter in the same way. So that gender was kind of gender was a point of fragmentation around even just those three groups which I was looking at for that research, only one of which is actually still going, and that's Britain First, which is a registered political party. And I was only looking at, it was much harder to talk to the Islamists at the time. There was because they were, al-Muhajirun has been banned for years, but the core people have continued to engage in activities. And in fact, Anjem Choudhury has just been received a life sentence for his activities leading al-Muhajirun. So it was incredibly important. And there was a difference between what was happening in the Islamist groups and the types of men that were required in order to kind of be good participants, be good activists for these groups. So I thought it was really, really important, and also important to kind of show those complexities in what was happening, and also to talk about women's participation and show in this book that, masculinities are, produced collectively through culture, through affect, in the symbols and that people use in order to kind of undertake activism and protest.
Mm. And so does that mean then that there are some actual quite interesting overlaps or similarities, I guess, between these different groups? I guess different groups of men, obviously, but still, were there some similarities there or differences?
Yeah, there were. I mean, when I first started talking to people, I found it quite odd that people had very different ideas about gender to me, and very different ideas about people, actually. So it was not... Most people that I spoke to, whether they were... And the Islamists were mainly immigrant heritage British, Bangladeshi or Pakistani, but not uniformly. There were some white people who were involved in this network as well. It wasn't just people who were strictly part of that kind of membership group. But they all kind of thought that the same people want to live together. So if you are British Irish, you'll want to live with other British Irish people, or if you're black, you'll want to live with other black people. Everybody seemed to think this, and I was like, I don't really think this. And they all thought that men and women have distinct roles. They have, it was either natural, like the people I spoke to who are part of, active in these anti-Islam far right groups were like, it's just natural, isn't it? Men do this, and that's just natural. And the Islamists that I spoke to were like, it's not just natural, it's God-given. It is a God-given duty to behave in a particular way. Women have this role and men have this role, and men and women are not equal. They have a relationship that they are duty-bound to uphold because that is what God intended. And obviously, the more fundamentalist you are, the more kind of rigidly, I guess, you kind of understand these roles. So that they had in common. And even though their lives were not, there was no real consistency between their lives and what they espoused in terms of, so people's actual individual lives often did not reflect this. So you would have far-right men activists who would, be saying all these things about, well, it's, it's men's duty. It's how we are, isn't it? We don't do the washing up, and then it would turn out that they were the sole carer for a child, for instance, and you would say, well, how does that kind of square with, well, that's different. That's, so there were these kind of, people, and I'm sure that this is true of everyone, not just of extremists, that we believe certain things, but our own lives they're not necessarily coherent in that sense, And then there was also this idea that we've talked about, this kind of gendered ideology. If you've got men and women in distinct roles, then that gives the whole structure to the group. It's about defence. It's about the defence of a certain group of people who are not being defended. The far right, we are substituting as nation, for state inaction on our behalf. So they're interested in nation as a form of kinship, this sort of, ethnic idea of nation, which we don't have anymore, because we have the state as open. Citizenship is open to anybody who is within the state, with certain provisos, but we are not an ethnically bound state. And they would deny that there was ethnicity involved in this, and they would deny that they were racist. But I think it was clear, not just looking at their activism itself, used there were lots of symbols of, unfortunately, sort of far right, that sort of racist kind of groups at protest. And those people weren't booted out, mostly they were kind of just, they were just there and they just joined in. And people, again, even where they had mixed race backgrounds, they kind of thought that nation was about ethnicity, or if not ethnicity, then religion, so that Britain should be secular, and that meant that if you were Muslim, then maybe it wasn't a place for you. So that was also this kind of, and there's also this idea of kind of seizing that label. So the Islamists wanted, they were the true owners of this true Islam, and the same for the anti-Islam far right. We alone are the people who really understand what nation is and what this country is. We are the patriots. We own that label, and everyone else is not doing enough to kind of maintain this. And that was kind of similar for both. And then the misogyny as well, and both sets of actors, there was misogyny obviously against out-group women. And I talk about, in-group and out-group in the book, because that's how they're defining, themselves really. So there's misogyny against out-group women, including obviously the Islamists. Some of the people they hated the most were actually, Muslim women who are not part of their fundamentalist scene. Non-Muslim women who are behaving in ways that they understand as degenerate, as immoral, as indecent. And in the far right, you would have this misogyny against Muslim women, obviously, which was kind of mixed with this protectivism narrative. We're going to protect these Muslim women from Muslim men, but at the same time, we abhor the hijab, we abhor the burqa, we abhor the niqab, even when women have chosen that for themselves. And then misogyny within those groups against the women of those groups, including, sexual slurs, which are very class-based slurs, which they used against each other, even though they are from the same class. So those are the things that they had in common, essentially.
You mentioned the research process a bit before, but I think in the book you say you attended 16 demonstrations and other activities organised by both sets of groups, and you conducted interviews with about 31 different members of those groups. So tell us a bit more about how you found that experience and how you approached it. I mean, it must have been pretty tricky doing that.
When I set off to do this PhD, quite a few people said, "Oh, you won't get anyone to talk to you." And I mean, I don't have vast numbers, right? But in terms of doing research in this kind of space, they're not bad numbers, because it's hard to talk to people. So I'll be honest, I don't think I knew what I was doing when I started this project. I mean, obviously I had read, I'd read what other people had done. I was like, right, well, this is what I'm going to do. This person did this, so I'm going to do the same. And I filled out my ethical approval form, and, I was not allowed to deceive people, and I wouldn't have wanted to deceive them anyway. And so I thought, right, well, I'll get some trusted gatekeepers, and then, that'll be it. And obviously that didn't work out that way. It was much easier to interview people on the far right because they were organising protests. I could just look on a Facebook page and I'll see, well, they're meeting at this point, so I'll go along. But still, it's quite hard for people to speak to you. They hate universities. They hate academics. They think that, universities are, and I don't know that they're entirely wrong in this. They think that they're liberal bastions who won't listen to them, who just write them off as having, whose opinions don't matter. And there's some truth to that, I think. And so it was hard to get people to talk to me. And some people talked to me and then they got in touch with me and said, I don't want you to use my interview. And then I had to really persuade them that to let them use it or to meet them again, And I think it helped to talk quite near the beginning of the research. I spoke to Tommy Robinson, who will pretty much talk, at that point anyway, he would talk to anyone. And so it's quite useful. He could link me in with people. And it was useful to say to people, well, I've spoken to Tommy Robinson. And again, like, people know he will talk to pretty much anyone, but it did help a little bit. And I spoke to Anjan Chowdhury also quite near the beginning of the research in a break in his trial at the Old Bailey, which was somebody that knew I wanted to speak to him, actually saw him on the Underground going to court while they were going to the BBC, which was a bit odd. And they gave him my number and they got his number. And so I got in touch with him that way. So and that helped a bit also. And I went to, and he said, come to my trial. So I went to his trial and I sat in the public gallery with obviously some of his supporters. No women were there, but some his male supporters from the group. And then they discussed together whether they would talk to me, and they decided they would. But, essentially when they decide that is, quite strategic, quite organised, and they're doing that for a very specific purpose. And that purpose is clearly to propagandise, and it's not really to be opening up or answering the sorts of questions that I wanted to ask. So yeah, it was tricky just to meet people in the first place, and then there are lots of ethical questions that come up when you're doing this that I didn't realise before I started doing the research. So I said, I'm going to do this empathetic research. What does that mean? I'm going to take it as read that these people all have a point, that I should listen to them, and that I should do that really listening to them, not just listening and then saying. And I'm not sure that I succeed in this in the book, that I wanted to be respectful to them because they gave their time to me and they did explain, sometimes quite complicated, quite difficult life stories to me. And I liked some of them. In fact, I liked most of them. There was, I don't like what they're doing. I don't like what they believe, but I quite like some of them. And I felt for some of them. And, and I saw them agonise about things. And I saw, injustices happen to them. And I felt their anger because they sometimes, shouted at me, especially, the far right ones were like, I've told you all this. I've met you X times. You've seen this. Why don't you agree with me? And I couldn't, it's like, well, I just don't agree with you because I don't accept this or that, or I have this value and not that value. And it was really hard sometimes. And, it was really difficult to write the book because I needed to get some distance from those relationships with those people, which were completely unbounded. I was answering texts, into the night. And I've done work subsequently on harms to researchers of online terrorism and extremism. But, I was behaving in quite unhealthy ways because I was quite, I really wanted the project to succeed. I wanted to maintain those relationships with people for the duration of the project, So all sorts of conundrums came up, opportunities to help people, times they asked for my help, whether I should help them in what capacity, going to demos, travelling with them to demos sometimes because it was just made sense. Just things that I didn't anticipate that I would be doing and dilemmas that I didn't anticipate on having. And then ultimately dealing with the fact that, some of the things that they said, they weren't wrong about. And of course they're not, because otherwise why would these groups gain, they're not wrong all the time. So they wouldn't gain followers if they weren't right some of the time. So it was really difficult. And I and I really wanted to remain, as I say, empathetic and respectful. And I hope that I did that without contributing to the problem, which is, again, difficult to assess in the immediate publication of a book or, you know.
You also said that you spoke to women in the British far right as well, and they're undoubtedly a minority, but they do exist, and sometimes in leading positions. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about their experiences and why they got involved, and was it a sort of hostile, sexist experience or environment for them in these movements?
Yeah, so this was a sort of key difference between talking to Al Muhajiroon and talking to the far right. I mean, Al Muhajiroon, they weren't allowed to protest. I didn't get to meet any women because the guys were like, we can't let you meet any women because we're worried that their kids will be taken into care. You know, if you talk to them, you're doing a project on extremism, then, you know. But I did talk to women in at protests for English Defence League, Britain First, for Britain, and I interviewed Jada Franson, who was then the deputy leader of Britain First. She's now set up her own group, the British Freedom Party. And she's actually talked about domestic violence and abuse at the hands of Paul Golding, who remains the Britain First leader. I mean, I think she really hates him. And she talked to me again just before the book came out. You know, and really, the key purpose for that for her was to get me to write about how awful he was in the book, which, you know, obviously I did. I did quote her sort of talking about that violence. Anne-Marie Waters was the leader of For Britain. Again, she's also disbanded For Britain. You know, and even those two leadership figures, completely different experiences, completely different motivations, not fans of one another at all. And, you know, there is no one motivation, but, you know, just look at both of those, you know, Jada Franson, Christian, anti-abortion. She was Catholic when I spoke to her. You know, she invited like people to come and talk at like, there was I think a sort of, I can't remember whether it was the AGM or I think it was an AGM that I'd gone to. And, but it was essentially, it was a sort of 2 hour, like a conference. She'd invited a speaker, and he was somebody who thought women were less intelligent than men because their brains are smaller, you know, and she was perfectly happy to invite him along, you know. She had this, she was absolutely not contesting patriarchy or misogyny. She was upholding it, even though she said, you know, I'm not a good leader. I should be married. I should have kids. I shouldn't be being this, you know, quite symbolic, you know, Boudica figure that she, you know, that's her kind of, you know, that's how people think of her. And that she is this female symbolic figure of nation, which of course is familiar from many nations across the world, you know. Completely happy to be part of that patriarchal system, you know, until she leaves, and then she's kind of, you know, she's not criticising the system, she's criticising one person within it, Paul Golding, for his abuse of her. And I would also, looking at her and Anne-Marie Waters on Twitter, on X recently, they both hate Andrew Tate with a passion. They think he's absolutely awful. So, and then you've got Anne-Marie Waters. You know, she was a former Labour Party activist. She's Irish, actually. Well, she's British now, but she's Irish. She is she's gay. She is coming to, you know, from a really sort of feminist, conventional kind of protest, you know, inviting a lot of women speakers, inviting a lot of feminist speakers from her transnational networks. She has also been, you know, obviously involved in things like Pegida, with trying to set up the German anti-Islam group in the UK, not successfully, with Tommy Robinson, you know, so she's not totally worried about, you know, the views of some of the misogynist views. Obviously, they're all anti-Islam. But completely different perspective from Jada Franson. You know, there's no love lost there at all between them. And Anne-Marie Waters found it phenomenally frustrating that the more kind of far right, more misogynist elements of the far right would give her a lot of abuse. You know, you shouldn't be visible, you shouldn't be a leader, we're anti-gay rights. You know, the traditional far right is completely heteronormative. The new far right had, you know, included gay rights, you know, because they would say, well, look at Islam. Islam is oppressive to gay people. Look at what we are. We represent something much more progressive. You know, we're pro-gay rights. So she represented something, you know, really completely different there. And I haven't spoken to her since the I haven't spoken to anyone really except for Jada Franson since the research ended. But I wonder the degree to which that pushback that she received from within the far-right movement, from people, as she said, who wanted women in the kitchen, who don't want women to even have the vote. I wonder how much of that was kind of, and she was, she's a Trump supporter. So I wonder how much of that was what led to the dissolution of For Britain. So those are two leadership examples. And when you talk to actual other women, and I talked to quite a few, though there's only a small number that gave me, proper interviews to include in the book. They again have very different backgrounds. They were really motivated as mothers on this kind of, this gendered narrative around women protecting women and children. And they were mobilising on behalf of women and children. And I'm not going to lie, I didn't think that was totally instrumental. They seemed to really believe this. Some of them had experienced male violence in the past, sexual assault. This was also true for some of the people that I spoke to in the Islamist group. And some of them were deterred by the prospect of violence at demonstrations. Some of them were motivated by it. They wanted to prove that they could, be as badass as the boys in the group, that they could be confrontational, that they were not afraid of, physical violence, because that is a means by which to prove one's status within this far-right environment. And in fact, not just in this far-right environment, but it had always been a means to prove status in the environments, the social communities from which these people came from. Violence was, it was a communicative practice. It was a hobby. It was a way of making friends. It was a thing you did on a Friday night because that's what you do. It's, Tommy Robinson said to me, best man at my wedding, guy I met in a fight outside a club. These are, violence meant something different to them. Everything meant something different to them because the norms are different. The value systems are slightly different. Everything's tweaked. So you share some things, but you really don't share others. And that violence, status, gender, all of these things. So those motivations for women were varied, and but they were motivated, and they were also keen to be visible and to have their voices heard. And for some of those women, it was the first time that their voices had been heard, and it was really hard for me not to feel some sort of, I don't even know what the right word is, some sort of understanding of what that meant to them, that they were, empowering themselves through these groups. And that was also true for the men. They were empowering themselves. They were finding agency through these groups where they had not found agency before, and where they had felt their agency was denied to them by all these mainly structures of power. Not all of them. I mean, bear in mind, I was talking to this, self-identified working class section of the far right, and the far right covers all demographics. But, basically the people that I was talking to mainly came from not great areas with, high crime rates, poor employment rates, few people going off to university. All those, and these are real problems. And they talked to me about these problems, and and how they have been part and parcel of their entry into these groups. And you can't just tell people, well, it's wrong that you're in this group, without starting to address all the problems that are part of the reasons why they join those groups. And that was another thing as well, with both the men. And I had really struggled to interview the women, and I think it was, that they were much more suspicious of me than the men. Again, because you're entering this gendered environment, masculinist environment, where I was quite a novelty. I'm this sort of something a bit new. I'm this academic, but I'm talking to them, and I'm going to the pub and I'm interviewing them, and wasn't really, I wouldn't say I wasn't challenging them, but I wasn't saying, well, you're wrong about that. Or, sometimes I would say, well, I don't know if that's right, if you've seen, but I would essentially listen and let them speak. And I think I did let them speak, but I found it really, these norms, people had very chaotic lives. And again, it's a real lesson for how to deal with this. And I feel that, in the wake of the riots, that long-term work in communities, ironing out these inequalities, which I think have been reported on for so long and exacerbated by, in my view, years of austerity, these things are going to take a long time.
I mean, it's interesting as well to wonder what some of the people you spoke to would make of your book, actually. Now it's out and you've finished the research. But I was wondering, my last question, Liz, was around, I suppose, what motivated you to want to do this research in the first place? What got you involved in in what is undoubtedly a very challenging, difficult area of study, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I used to work in radio journalism, so I wanted to go out and talk to people. Okay, so in terms of methods, that's what I wanted to do. Mm. In terms of that problem in the first place, I was worried about what's happening in our society. I'm worried about the set of circumstances that leads to a Tommy Robinson, but not just a Tommy Robinson, but how popular he is. And he's popular for good reasons, and he has qualities as well as being really divisive. There are positive things about Tommy Robinson, and there are many positive things from the point of view of his many followers, right? So I wanted to work out what are those and what is the context of that. And, ultimately, what do we do to counter this? Clearly I don't want to live in a society which is really divided and where people feel like, Tommy Robinson has more of the answers than anybody you're ever likely to vote for. And Tommy's obviously, he has stood in elections, right? People say he hasn't done very well, but actually he got thousands of votes when he'd stood a few years ago in the Northwest. He lost his deposit, but, thousands of people voted for him. To me, that is like a little bit of a troubling sign. So I wanted to better understand that. And I feel like I did better understand it, but it didn't make me feel like our society is actually equipped to deal with it. And worse, since the pandemic, much worse, since social media, since Musk has taken over Twitter and it's X, these problems these tribal identities are so much more deeply entrenched. There is so much less listening. There is so much less space to listen, with empathy to people. A lot of my friends were like, how can you listen to these people? How can you sit with these people? How can you talk to these people? Much more about the far right than about the Islamists, even though they believe also abhorrent things and have causing huge harm. And I was like, well, I'm doing it to try and understand, and I'm doing it analytically, and I am switching part of me off and to enable this when I'm doing it. And I really hope that, I don't know of anyone who's read that book, right? And I think they're not going to like the title, right? They're not going to like being called extreme because they wouldn't see themselves as being extreme. They're not going to like that for a start. I really hope that if they read it, they would feel that I have not actually misrepresented them, that I have represented what they told me. Okay, I've contextualized it, I've analysed it, I've criticised it within my gendered framework. I'm not sure that they would, I'm not sure that they'd be that interested in that approach to it, but I hope that they would recognise themselves in there, right? Because if they didn't, then I would be worried that I had taken something from them rather than, and it's ethically difficult because, none of us wants to be a voice piece or a platform for any of these people. But at the same time, in doing this research with integrity, it would be wrong not to also reflect them genuinely in that book. And I guess I hope that people reading the book can see that, and that I navigate that tension between those aims.
Certainly given us and our listeners quite a lot to think about today. And clearly there's some long-term issues to sort out, definitely. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, it's one last final comment. These issues can be sorted out. And I do think that some of that work that is done with men in probation in prisons that engages with masculinities and how men understand themselves in a language that they use and understand is appropriate work for trying to tackle extremism also. And if there is any one takeaway from the book, it's that work can be done, it is being done, and I think it can help men to live better lives away from violence and problems that affect them but affect all of us as well.
Absolutely. And goodbye to your lovely dog.
Just put her in the frame there.
It's a shame our listeners
so much.
won't be able to appreciate the wonderfulness of your dog. But no, thank you for giving me your time to speak to us and for your amazing work.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Sandy, I don't know what the weather's like where you are, but it's got incredibly windy here. So if it's not spiders I'm having to deal with, it's gale force winds. But hopefully the call will keep going. So what did you make of the conversation with Elizabeth?
Yeah, well, it's all fine here, by the way, although we are rather subject to extreme weather events on a regular basis. But in terms of the conversation, I mean, the first thing it made me think of was the fact that I went to one of the counter-protests in Oxford, which is my hometown, as listeners probably know. And it was interesting because there had been threats made against a sort of legal and support advice centre, and also against an asylum hostel. Some people call them asylum hotels. I mean, they quite often are hotels, but actually, their experiences are very much not like being in a hotel.
No.
Anyway, so threats have been made, and then a large number of people turned up in East Oxford. The traditional left, if you like, liberal left, speeches and so on, but also alongside them, quite a large number of young Muslim men as well, close to the central mosque. And these groups stood sort of slightly apart from each other. And it was just quite interesting thinking, I wonder how these groups think about each other, because there wasn't really any conversation going on between them. So that was interesting, going forward. What are the sort of links between the sort of anti-racist groups going to be looking like, and how important is it to build those links? But in practice, actually the advice centre had said we don't really want people to come along because there's no one in the office. We don't want any trouble, etc., etc. But probably 300 people turned up outside, and I think they were probably felt empowered by that, really, and heartened by that suddenly, out of nowhere, there was this upsurge of support within the community for them and for their work and for the people that they're working with. And so I think there's something important about that, which should be recognised. But moving on to what Liz was saying, it made me think about a couple of issues. One was, the issues of inequality, as she talked about towards the end, and the whole long-term task of rebuilding public services, really, particularly in disadvantaged communities. And, some people have complained about the government settling strikes and giving more pay to public sector workers. But in a sense, that's all about, recognising the importance of public service. And, that seems to be at least one aspect of a solution for the future. But the other thing I thought about was the links between the far right and what some might call the more mainstream right. I mean, she mentioned this character, Nigel Farage, and, clearly he's been a significant figure on the right. But he would say, well, he has been instrumental in fending off the far right. I've heard him say that. Whereas actually, he's very often given them, or appears to have given them a nod and a wink, encouraged them. And so he's, in some ways, feeding off, their anger and their populism as well. So, we didn't talk about that, but I think it's interesting. And that's without mentioning members of the Conservative Party as well, who, you could also say have been at least linked in terms of some of the ideology. So,
well, yeah, I mean, it's notable, isn't it, that I think Farage has said kind things about Andrew Tate in the last year, for example. And I do think that, you'd like to think that a lot of much more mainstream forces in society, whether that's in the media or in politics, would be asking themselves questions about, well, what role have we actually played? Because, of course, these ideas haven't come from nowhere, have they, in terms of anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Islamic sentiment. This stuff has been brewing in the UK for a very long time, hasn't it? And it does feel like it's been getting to a higher and higher intensity after things like Brexit. And as Elizabeth mentioned, the impact of austerity, the fact that the UK is incredibly unequal. And we didn't get a chance to talk about it much, but she does talk about it in her book. I guess the question of intersectionality, that this isn't just about gender, it is also about class, it's about race, and the fact that, there are lots of men out there who do feel kind of marginalized from mainstream society, who maybe don't have much power, certainly economically, for example. And yet they are, they're still raised to think that being a man means being powerful, means being in control. And I guess the far right or other groups, there is an element of it, because of course, it's people like Farage who are perhaps at the top of the far right, often themselves are not from working class backgrounds, but there's an element of exploitation, isn't there, of working class men in particular, selling them this idea that you can be a real man, you can be powerful if you get involved in this kind of movement. And I guess perhaps it ties in with the idea that Raewyn Connell talks about, of protest masculinity, that the far right is one kind of very damaging expression of that. And I think that you can really see that if you look at the trials that have been happening, in the wake of the riots. Often these are people who don't have very much. They're living in quite desperate circumstances sometimes. And I guess it just shows, doesn't it, as we've discussed with Elizabeth, the real need for long-term work to be done to engage with people, to kind of try and de-radicalize and bring them out of these movements. And I guess that does have to involve an element of listening there as well, doesn't it? As Elizabeth has done with her research, that kind of empathy, never to excuse what they've done. We're not in any way trying to excuse, because it is, horrifically damaging and must have been terrifying for lots and lots of people. But at the same time, if we want to understand this and try and change things and reduce the kind of scapegoating that's going on of particular groups, then we have to engage with people, don't we? And listen to them and actually have a dialogue. And you have seen a bit of that as well, I think, haven't you, during and after the riots?
Yeah. I thought she was also very interesting on the sort of, I don't know how to call it really, but the confusion of people's everyday lives, and when she said, well, she talked to somebody whose ideology was very much the traditional view of, men should be in charge and husband at work, wife at home and all this sort of stuff. And yet at the same time, they were a carer at home and they couldn't sort of identify with that role. And that was somehow sort of undermining of their masculinity.
Yeah, and it just shows, doesn't it, the need to take into account gender and masculinity as we try and engage with these people, which just highlights the importance of Elizabeth's work and her book, which is a great read, obviously incredibly relevant at the moment, so do check it out.
Yes, indeed. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, as always, for listening. Contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you ever have questions or comments or feedback. Do subscribe to the podcast if you're not doing so already, and please do share it with your friends and colleagues. We'll be back with another episode soon. But take care for now.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.